My talk tonight is going to start with the Cartographic Revolution that kind of kicks off in Europe in the early 1400s. And it sort of travels around Europe. By the time it gets to England, which is sort of the geographic place where our story unfolds tonight, it's the mid-1500s. And the story I want to tell today is a little different from the story we usually know about maps. I think most of us in this room probably, we like a good map. Am I right? We like a map. How old were you when you first encountered a map? You were young, right? 5, 4, 6, 3, 2, 1. You were born a map. Yeah. Most of us grow up and we love the map. We're familiar with the story of maps. The idea that maps are just these gorgeous aesthetic objects, and they unleash all sorts of potential for exploration and discovery. Yeah. We know that story. The story I want to tell tonight is not about the good side of maps. It's about the bad and the ugly side of maps. And I want to talk about maps in that cartographic revolution, in that moment in the Renaissance, when the modern map as we know it is coming into being. And I want to tell the story of how at that moment when the modern map as we know it came to be, people were in that moment freaked out by them. They were allured, they were amazed, they were also really unsettled, and they were alarmed, and they were worried. And I think there's something really generative in the reasons why they were concerned. And so I want to talk about those reasons why people in the Renaissance were freaked out about maps. And then I also want to talk about the reasons why we might be freaked out by maps and why I think that's actually helpful and not just a whole lot of freaking out about maps. Okay. So let me say a couple things about that cartographic revolution. It kicks off in Europe, as I said, in the early 1400s. And this is a moment that is often called by historians of cartography the golden age of maps, right? So this is a moment when the map becomes more precise, more accurate, more accessible, more affordable than ever before. And there are a couple reasons why there's this flourishing of maps, map making, and map technology at this moment. There's a confluence of events. Among them, there are some important advances in mathematics, especially in trigonometry. There's the importation into the British Isles of new technologies like copperplate engraving, which allows you to make even finer marks in your maps, more precise imaging. And then there's also sort of growth in the need for practical spatial arts, things like surveying, right? So all these things come together, and there's this perfect storm, and we end up with this cartographic revolution. Maps go from rarity to ubiquity. Right? And it's really hard to overstate the effects of this change. Imagine that you were living in 1530. You probably wouldn't have encountered a map when you were 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 17, 38, 52, 89. You could go your whole life never encountering a map. Maps at this point, up until the early 1500s, were rare objects. They were incredibly expensive. They were often hand-drawn. You would really probably never see one in your life. By the time we get to the 1570s and 80s, within a single lifetime, they're everywhere. They're so ubiquitous, they're on the backs of playing cards, like this deck of cards here. So in the course of that lifetime, this cartographic technology just explodes. So we might think about this in parallel to the advent of personal computing in the 20th century. It changes everything. It changes politics, it changes economics, it changes military strategizing, it changes diplomacy, it changes arts and letters. Everything is altered by this because there's suddenly all new ways of representing the world and of making use of those representations. And there are lots of uses that can be made of it. And we know some of those uses already. We know that people then and now love to have maps as decoration in their homes. People were allured by them. They were just wonderful to have in the background. People would decorate their homes with them, this whole new way of inhabiting the world by actually putting the world on the walls of your house. But as with any new technological innovation and its dissemination into a wider culture, there are going to be a lot of feelings about it. And your relationship to maps and to this new cartographic ubiquity was probably inflected by what you did and what your daily life was like and how maps changed your daily life. So it's one thing to delight in the aesthetic object of the map, but imagine that you are a fisherman and you have spent your lifetime doing what your parents did and what your grandparents did, which is to jealously protect your practical knowledge of that coastline. You know your fishing area better than anybody else, and you do not share that with anyone because you do not want to give your competition a leg up. However, the Dutch come in. The Dutch, known throughout the 16th and 17th century as, and this is true, butter lovers. I don't know why. They show up, and the Dutch have much better maps than the English. Cartographic Revolution gets to the Netherlands much sooner than it gets to England. So the Dutch show up, and they've got maps of the English coastline, and they're so much better than any map in the mind of or in the hands of any English fisherman. And so suddenly, the English fishermen are at a disadvantage because of this whole map thing. You're going to be worried about that if you're a fisherman. Let's imagine, say, you are a tenant farmer. Okay? You've been farming the same land for years and years and years, just like your parents, just like your grandparents. And then one day, the owner of that land sends a surveyor who shows up, makes a map of that terrain and says, hey, you know what? Actually, this land is a little bigger than you thought it was. You know what that means to you, tenant farmer? That means your rent is going up. And this is why, for much of this period, surveyors actually had to work under armed guard because the maps that they were making were an economic danger to the people living in those areas that were mapped. So there are lots of sort of negative feelings that crop up with the arrival of this map technology, right? And so this is a story about some of those anxieties. In my research, I grouped these anxieties, these sort of negative feelings about maps, into three loose, baggy areas. And I'm going to talk very quickly about the first two. The first two sets of anxieties are kind of twins. They're like the flip sides of one another. But then I want to really dig into the third area of anxiety, the third reason to be sort of freaked out about maps in the Renaissance and today, and why that matters, okay? So let me talk very quickly about the first set of anxieties. The first things that people were freaked out about when it came to maps, map making, map technology, map uses in the moment. And the first thing that people might be worried about with maps is that maps might actually not be really good at representing what you think they're representing, right? And that's not really the map's fault. I mean, a map only works by being a series of choices about what to include and what to exclude, right? So any map is necessarily going to leave out an awful lot of stuff. But sometimes the stuff it leaves out, the stuff that it fails to represent, is really important stuff. So, for example, take a look at this map here. This is a 1630s map of the Americas. This map is really good at representing some things. Toponyms reflecting sort of European colonialist ventures in this area. You know what it's really bad at representing? The fact that people lived in these areas. In fact, the people who lived in the Americas prior to those colonialist ventures, they're literally marginalized. They're pushed to the margins of that page, right? So this map is actually failing to tell a story that I think we can all agree probably should have been a little better told. So first set of anxieties, maps aren't actually doing a good job of representing the most important things. The second set of anxieties, again, sort of the flip side of this, is that sometimes maps do too good a job at representing stuff. Sometimes maps represent things in ways that are creepily good. And the best thing a map is good at representing, the thing it represents absolutely the best, is the interests of the powers that bankroll its construction, right? So let's take a look, for example, at this map. Again, a series of choices of inclusion and exclusion. This map, we are told by the cartouche in the upper left-hand corner, is a description of the flourishing kingdom of England. Yay, England! Look at England, full of toponyms, topographical features. You get your mountains, you get some hand-inked forests, right? This is a beautiful, beautiful map of England. Let's look across the channel, shall we, at Ireland. under brutal colonial occupation. What do we know about Ireland from this map? We know two important things about Ireland from this map. Number one, 4 sheep live there. The second thing we know about Ireland is that it doesn't matter. The only thing that matters about Ireland is that flourishing England literally is standing atop it, right? That is what matters. That story comes through loud and clear, right? That is the creepy story that map is taking. Okay. So there are these two twinned anxieties. Maps represent things badly, or they represent things way too well. And we could talk more about those anxieties in Q&A. But for now, I want to turn to that third group of anxieties, the third reason that people in the Renaissance were freaked out about maps. And that third set of reasons has to do with the fact that the map was the product of an arms race. Remember that cartographic revolution I was mentioning earlier? The reason that kicked off in the first place, the reason there was an interest in refining map technologies was because in the late 1300s, early 1400s, there were refinements in cannonry and in cannon technology, which meant that you could shoot a cannon from further away and with greater precision than you could before. And so in an era of siege warfare, when you have a cannon that can shoot bigger stuff further with greater precision, you're going to need the best topographical information you can so that you can sight that cannon and better destroy the walls of the city you're laying siege to. And so, suddenly, there's an arms race to create the best maps possible, and the cartographic revolution flourishes as a result of that. And so this association with the map as a military technology, this association of the map with armed belligerence and state-sponsored violence, this is well known in the period. This image here is a portrait of Elizabeth I, who is celebrated in this portrait as being the monarch after the defeat of the Spanish Armada. You could see over her shoulder the ships going down in a failed invasion of England. And this now means that England has the world's most dominant naval military force. And how does she celebrate this? She puts her hand on top of a globe, right? And the importance of maps, the strategic value of maps, not just their sort of cultural association with the military, but their actual practical association with military campaigning and strategy, was well known in the time. So Elizabeth's counselor, William Cecil, the Lord Burleigh, who is also the architect of her Secret Service, and the architect, too, of much of her centralized state, we could call it a police state, he commissioned hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of maps. He employed scores of surveyors, cartographers, hydrographers to get the most current information he could in cartographic form. This is a page from one of his atlases, and we know that in his atlases he would actually hand ink in notations. And what was he using his maps to do? What do those notations reflect? They reflect things like the location of materials that could be requisitioned in the event of an invasion. They identify the location of people who could be conscripted in the event of an invasion. He kept track of the location of religious dissidents who might be sympathetic to invaders and who, in the event of international struggle, you might want to eliminate as a threat. So this is the use of maps for him. It's widely known that maps present this sort of strategic value. And it's not just in England. Across the channel, Philip II of Spain had this huge collection of maps he kept under lock and key because he knew that any leak of those documents would represent a real advantage to his adversaries. And if you ever look closely at a map of the world, you probably see these little ships that are like sailing around on the waters. Those ships sometimes remind you, too, of the sort of belligerent context in which the map occurs. Sometimes those ships are actually firing cannonballs at one another. Sometimes they're firing cannonballs at land. You just get a sense that the map here is flourishing at a moment when international conflict is nearly continuous. Certainly the threat of it is nearly continuous. And in this regard, the story of the map and its sort of attachment to military origins is not different from the map we have today. At the moment, in the late 20th, early 21st century, we're actually living through a second cartographic revolution. We're living through the digital cartographic revolution. And so many of us in this room right now probably have a smartphone in our pockets, yeah? Your smartphone probably has a map app on it, right? The reason those map apps prevent us from getting lost on the streets of Baton Rouge anymore is because in the early 80s, the US Department of Defense lifted into orbit a network of satellites that form the bones of our GIS grid, the whole point of which was to keep an eye on US adversaries and allies. And so, you know, we might be able to go days, weeks, months not thinking about this, but you know, the reason that I can plug in an address and my phone tells me where to go is the same reason why we can fly drones thousands of miles away. And so there is something sort of unsettling about this use of the technology, the fact that the sort of military context drives the refinement of cartography. But in any case, this was top of mind for folks in the Renaissance. There's nothing hidden or subtle about this. Think about any time you might see a Shakespeare play with a map on stage as a prop. Bad sign. Bad sign. King Lear. You don't have to read King Lear to know from its title, The Tragedy of King Lear, that bad things happen. And you know they're going to happen in Act 1, Scene 1, because a guy walks on stage with a map that he then uses to divide his kingdom. And spoiler alert, bad things happen after that, right? Any play where you see a map, there's usually an army on the march, usually multiple armies on the march. So this is top of mind. And it's also explicit. So if you look at Mercator's Atlas, this is actually marketed as a really helpful resource for fortifying one's territory or preparing for warlike expedition. If you look at the first road atlas of England, what is a road atlas good for? It's not for, like, planning your vacation, getting around. No. Why do you need that road atlas? Why do you need those maps of the roads? Well, golly, because you might have civil war or invasion, right? So what is a map about? It is about living in a time of large-scale violence. So I want to, because I'm an English professor, I have to talk about a poet. And so we're going to look at a passage from John Milton's epic poem from 1667, reissued 1674, called Paradise Lost. There are a couple things you need to know about John Milton before I get to this passage. The first thing to know about poet, polemicist, political revolutionary John Milton is that he was a lover of maps. Now, this is a little tidbit about his history. I have lots of great stories about John. And so in Q&A, please, someone ask me about how Paradise Lost was written. But for now, let me just focus on the maps. So he loved maps. He collected maps and atlases throughout his life. As a matter of fact, John Milton goes blind in 1654. He dies in 1674. In that 20 years that he's living blind, he continues to collect maps and atlases. Continues to do it. He sends people abroad to actually buy atlases and bring them back to him, right? This is a guy who's profoundly invested in the signifying power of the map. Second thing you need to know about John Milton is that he knows a lot about war. He was on the intellectual vanguard of the parliamentary and Puritan side during the English Civil Wars. He himself lived on a street called Artillery Road. Like, this is a guy who knows something about it. As a matter of fact, he's so committed to the cause that after the restoration of the king in 1660, he ends up under house arrest for the rest of his life because he was so up to his eyeballs in the Civil War. Like, this is a guy who is well acquainted both with maps and with their sort of military uses on the ground. Okay, so Book 11 of Paradise Lost. It's near the end. This is a 12-book poem, 10,000 lines, ostensibly about Adam, Eve, Eden, the paradise of the title that is lost. But in Book 11, Adam, the first human, gets brought to the top of a mountain by an angel who's been charged to show Adam the full expanse of human history. And as you might know, all of us having some sense of human history, what Adam sees is not great. But there's one episode in particular that really, really upsets Adam. I mean, he's just in tears. He's speechless at the end of it. It's really not a great episode. What Adam sees from the top of the mountain is a couple cities on a plain. And the way those cities are described in the poem, we're given to understand that what Adam is seeing is the city as it is represented in the city view. This is a sort of quasi-cartographic genre, super popular at the time. People love to have an image of the city on the wall of their home, really popular aesthetic object. But it is also one of the prime sources of military campaign info, again, in that era of siege warfare. People would get all sorts of information about the city from these city views before they attack. So Adam is looking out on this plain. He sees a couple cities represented in this cartographic idiom. And then he sees the armies that are massing between those cities. And then he sees the siege warfare that plays out on those cities. And he sees what that warfare does, piling carcasses on a plain that is actually ensanguined, which is to say it's just full of blood. He sees carcasses piled high. He sees slaughter and gigantic deeds. And he's horrified. Because what he's watching here is the origin of the modern map, right? This is the origin of that cartographic revolution that produces these maps that Milton loves so much. And so at the end of this poem, we get this vision of just the power of this technology to rip people apart, this technology that helps us represent the world in new ways, helps us see the world in new ways, and the revelation that so often that technology is used not to make the world more representable for purposes of seeing it or treasuring it, but to make the world more representable for purposes of destroying it, making it destructible. And this is kind of I know it's kind of a downer of a passage to wrap on, but I don't want to leave us there. I want to say that this is not the only thing that Paradise Lost tells us, right? It tells us the terrible things that people can do with the technology they have, including the technology that seems most alluring, most possibly, empowering. The technology that's most likely to help us find new ways of living in the world is also the technology that's most likely to destroy us. But this is also a poem about how that doesn't have to be the story. Right? Paradise Lost is a poem that actually tells us, as human beings, how we can be okay. Right? The lesson of Paradise Lost is, if you want to be a good person, you take care of the environment, and you take care of one another. And I find it very moving, right, that John Milton, who loves maps, grapples with the dangers of the misused map in this poem on his way to saying, there is a way to be better. There is, in fact, a way to be better humans. There's a way to be humane. And I think that if we learn a lesson from the Renaissance and from the way people grappled with this technology, this suddenly ubiquitous technology that promised to change everything in their lives, then maybe we ourselves might become a little more reflective about the maps in our lives, the maps that seem so effortlessly to shape our literal worldview. And if it makes us a little more reflective about how a line on a map decides, for example, in a congressional district, whose vote matters and whose doesn't. Or if a line on a map decides among countries who gets to be safe and who doesn't. Or if the lines on a map are understood to be fragile things that are shifting, sometimes at the rate of 1 football field an hour in the era of rising sea level, then maybe attending to those anxieties of map making might actually help us find a way forward into a future in which we are actually quite good to one another. In which case, being freaked out about map might actually be one of the better things we as a species do. So, thanks.